My name is Lachlan Huddy. I wrote this little short story called The Whore and the Healer, and the excerpt I'm going to read today is the second scene, just where the main characters are talking about things that are about to happen. So here we go. Toby woke with a snuffle when Jones tapped his cheek. "Gird your loins, boyo," Jones said. "I'm not sure which way trouble's coming from first." Noticing Jackie standing awkward in the doorway, Toby said, "Oh shit, later," Jones said. "I reckon we've till sundown before this whole grapevine singing about your miracle hands. Also, I just scorned a pimp and he's not the forgiving sort. I say it was bugger off time yesterday." Jones had enough time to think, "Don't give me the look," before Toby gave him the look. Face too still, eyes just a little too wide. "You want to go?" Toby said. "Be best, mate." Toby cleared his throat. "I thought we could help him. You know, with I know what you thought, mate. I don't think it's a good idea this time." Jones felt like a man falling from the sky and snatching at clouds. Toby whispered, "Please, No clouds now. Just the fall." "All right, mate." Jones fought back the worry in his chest. "Back to sleep for now, though, eh? I'll get things sorted after lunch. You sure? You want to stay? We'll figure it out. Have a kip, mate." "Thank you." The word hard for Toby to say, but not because he wasn't grateful. He rolled over, resettled himself for sleep. Jones waited until his breathing had evened out before standing and turning to Jackie. "You mind taking me to the sergeant's?" I wrote this a long time ago, so I'm gonna reach back through the memories. But I really like. I mean, this story is very much a western. So I think Jones really fits into that grand old western tough guy tradition. He's a very pragmatic guy, but his weakness is the people that he cares about. And I think you can see when you're reading the story in his character how those two things kind of interplay. And so he, like Jackie, was very instinctive. Once I got him talking, dialogue's a very big thing for me. So once I can get those characters talking, I can get a much better, much clearer sense of who they are. And that was very much the case with Jones. I think I always had the sense from the beginning that he was a fatherly figure too. And so all of those kind of character points I just mentioned, I had clear from the start, or I had clear very early on, and then I just kind of let them guide his decisions and guide how the story came out. Yeah, that's a good question. That he was secondary to Jones, I think, and I think if you wanted to. Sorry, let me start again. I think if you wanted to apply any analysis to this story, it's kind of a drug addiction allegory. And so the character of Toby is the addict. He's addicted to healing, but if he takes it too far, then very, very bad things happen. And I think that's a really kind of blunt, simple drug addiction analogy. And so I wanted to show him, as kind of the victim of that addiction, but also his decisions are his own. And even if he's in the end powerless before this addiction of his, he's still responsible for, and he's still empowered in the decisions he makes in regards to that addiction. So I wanted to show kind of a victim, but also, someone who was still in control of their own destiny. Because I think ultimately that's a very, the most humanizing thing. And that's what I wanted to show with Toby. I didn't want him to be an outright villain, but I also wanted to show someone who is very flawed and someone who is not always making the right decisions. For me, I can only speak from my own experience. So again, I always go back to dialogue. I think the best and the most evocative and the most visceral way that you can get a character jumping off the page is through their dialogue. If you can master that, then I think everything follows from that. At least it does for me. But of course, I mean, dialogue is one of my most favorite things in fiction, right? In anything, in movies, in the written word too. I just love dialogue. So of course I'm going to say that. But yeah, I think that's been the most useful thing to me. And the next, I suppose secondary to that, I would just fall back onto the old chestnut show, don't tell. If you can just show their actions. And maybe you don't even really need to understand what those actions mean in that first draft. Just put them down there and sort of, and maybe work from gut instinct. And then you can, in the rewrites, you can take a step back and you can say, well, what does that actually mean? And does that fit with the overall character? And you can kind of edit it down from there. So yeah, in my simplest form, my advice would be get them talking and get them moving and then see where that takes you. Yeah, absolutely. I recently finished a book by an Australian author called Rowan Wilson, I believe. And that book was called The Roving Party. And it's based on actual history. One of the states in Australia is a state called Tasmania. It's the little island that's off the south of Australia. This was probably the case in all states, but definitely in Tasmania back in the 1800s, there was a royal commission for the white colonists to hunt down the indigenous Australians in that area. And so this story follows that and follows... it's a fictionalization of an actual roving party from those days. But one of the most fascinating characters to me in that was the second in command in this hunting party, because he was an Indigenous Australian himself, which you really needed back then, because Indigenous Australians were such masters of the land, such great hunters and trackers, and they really understood the land. And as like a colonist back then, say a British colonist or a first generation white Australian in those days, you didn't have that understanding of the land. And this character's name was Black Bill. And I think they never really dove into his motivations, which made him all the more fascinating. But I found this figure who had been driven to turn against his own people in such a fundamental way really fascinating. And because a lot of it was told from his perspective, and a few really relatable tragedies befell him over the course of the book, you really related to him, even though he was doing these really atrocious things, along with the other members of this roving party. So I really like that. I do find I like characters who have superficial contradictions, but if you kind of scratch the surface, you can really understand where they're coming from. And by the end of that book, I think you really did get a sense of where Black Bill was coming from, whether you agree with him or not. And so I just thought he was such a wonderfully rendered character. And also that book is just brilliantly written too, I think. So I highly recommend that one, The Roving Party by Rowan Wilson. Yeah, okay, so I squat really well. Turns out I'm very good at that. Ooh, good one. I am not sure. I'm going to say at a friend's wedding 4 years ago. It was a Greek Orthodox church, so there was lots of chanting in Latin and Greek. So it was a really cool ritualistic experience. Yeah, absolutely. You know what I've been listening in terms of the audience for this show and who didn't. I think they'd really enjoy something called the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast. It's just two guys and they're really big H.P. Lovecraft fans, and they go through all of Lovecraft's stories and then other pieces of weird fiction. And they just give you the synopsis. They do readings of excerpts, and then they discuss the stories themselves and the backgrounds to the stories and the history behind them. And they're great hosts. There's a lot of charisma on display. And it's just really great fun, whether you're a Lovecraft fan or not. I think if you're into stories, you're into the backgrounds to stories, that's a great one. So get on that, the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.